everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 5th of August. So at this point, we have completed speech number 1. You should have received feedback from me about speech number 1, where I would have used the template that was included in our syllabus and also written a few comments and assigned a letter grade to that first speech. And I also would have returned your speaking outline to you, which I evaluate informally just on a checkmark system. A plus is excellent, a check plus is very good, check is satisfactory, a check minus is less than satisfactory, and a minus is unsatisfactory. And I probably would have given you a suggestion or two about ways that you could improve your outline. So now we're ready to move to our next speech, which happens to be the informative speech, and personally, my favorite speech. So today I wanted to talk about the informative speech, and if you're curious as to what your attendance question is going to be, it'll be requesting that you view all of your classmates' speeches and send me privately a strength and weakness of all of those speeches, because part of the class is serving as audience as well as being the speaker, but more on that later. First, as you can see in the notes below, we're talking about finding and using supporting material. Now, you're not required to use outside resources for the second speech, the informative speech. You might elect to do so, but you will be required to use outside resources for your third speech, your last graded speech, the persuasive speech. So I thought I may as well put that sooner rather than later in our readings in the event that you thought you might want to use some outside resources for your informative speech. You are, however, going to be required to use some sort of audio-visual aid, which is why I assigned visual media for us to talk about today. And obviously, the chapter on speeches to inform is directly related to speech number 2. And you can decide to choose a completely new topic from what you talked about in speech 1, or perhaps you talked about something in speech 1 that you would like to inform us about or teach us more about. And basically, do think of it as a speech in which you teach your audience. And there are lots of things you can teach us about: people, places, things, events, ideas, procedures. You have 10 minutes, which is double the time for what you had with your first speech, with using some sort of an audio or visual aid. And there are different kinds of informative speeches. There's the explanatory speech, where you define things. There's the demonstrative or demonstrative speech, and that's basically where you show how to do something. There's also the report, which you might do in, let's say, a workplace, or you might do, let's say, in an academic classroom where you have to interpret something. And sometimes you're mixing and matching a little bit of all three. Some suggestions: be clear and be organized. Be logical. Limit your points. Remember how poor our memory and listening skills are. Use transitions to show connections from one idea to another. Avoid jargon, which is unnecessarily complex language that's devoted usually to a particular group or profession. Cluster like ideas together. That's one of the mnemonic techniques that we oftentimes utilize when we're trying to learn new information. Associate new ideas with old ideas. Old teaching technique. You might have seen this in math classes, for instance. Use repetition, and you'll repeat yourself more when you're speaking than you would if you were writing a paper, because again, you don't have the luxury when you're listening to a speech to go back and reread the way you would when you are reading a paper. Address different learning styles. People learn and retain information differently, and it's one of the reasons why teachers will oftentimes talk but also write content, so that you've got a combination of the two, depending on whether you learn best orally or whether you learn best visually. And if you're not necessarily sure, what you might want to try is how you deal with directions. Though I know that the world is different now with GPS, but if you're the kind of person that just remembers a set of directions, that probably means that you are orally focused as opposed to having to read those directions, which means that you might be written focused. And of course, if you actually have to travel to that particular place, then you might actually have to do the actual activity. And schools tend to focus on written and oral communication, as you know. So if you need to actually engage in a process, oftentimes you're at a disadvantage in traditional education. Think about what will be effective for an audiovisual, not just the fact that you're required to use an audiovisual, but how will it assist your audience in being able to understand and retain the information, and motivating the audience so that they're interested enough in the subject in which you are discussing. So, visual media. Now, there's lots of different ways to use visual and audio, and one of the advantages of using both visual and audio is that it increases comprehension, it increases memory, and it increases the persuasive element. So you can go as low tech or as high tech as you'd like. Sometimes when you think about face to face classes, and sometimes the best way to do something is just to use the whiteboard or even the blackboard, if a blackboard still exists in the classroom, which works very nicely for a spur of the moment diagram, or if you needed to illustrate something quickly, or if you're having technological failure. Pictures work very well for emotional responses from audiences. Of course, you've got to think about scale and how you're going to present that particular picture. Posters can work very nicely as well. You want to make sure that the poster is visible, and also that if you are using an audiovisual, that you are incorporating it into your speech so that you're referencing it in the speech. I've seen some people get so nervous that they forget to even mention their audiovisual. And the audiovisual should supplement, it should not substitute for you. So the idea is that we want to hear a speech from you. This is a public speaking class, after all. This isn't a class in, let's say, PowerPoint, but more on PowerPoint in a moment. Props and models can work very well, but again, you have to think about things like scale, how visible they are, um, video and audio clips. And again, you have to think about the technology behind that and how are you going to show that visual and audio clip. And again, you want to think about balance. So the bulk of your speech should not be a visual or an audio clip. The bulk of your speech should be you. I would say I devote for a 10-minute speech no more than 3 minutes maximum for an audio visual, because again, we want to hear from you, not from the audio visual. Flip charts, if you don't know what a flip chart is, they were basically sheets of paper on a large pad that would be put on an easel. And it's what I call a kind of pre-PowerPoint. It's what PowerPoint does now, but at the time we didn't have PowerPoint. And the beauty of it was that you got to decide when to reveal pieces of information. So you could keep your audience's attention up until the point that you reveal the information. If you use Zoom, you're probably familiar with screen sharing. A couple of suggestions that always make sense: be professional. Make sure you test your equipment beforehand, and you've got a backup plan. Charts tend to work very nicely for numbers. Pictures, as I had said earlier, tend to work very nicely for emotions. Be clear, be simple, be neat. Consider scale and proportion. Use color for interest, but not too much color so that you're distracting your audience. You want to be neat. You want to be accurate. You want to avoid all capital letters. Just capitalize those things that are important. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of reading a paper that's written in all caps. I think every English teacher has. And it is a very painful experience because it's very difficult to differentiate the words if they're all in caps. So if you're going to capitalize a word in its entirety, make sure that you wanted to emphasize that word. And in fact, what studies have shown that if you really want to emphasize something, that if you bold it rather than underline it, the audience is more likely to remember it. So In terms of the visual media that you can use for this particular class, because obviously we are recording our speeches. So I don't know how technologically savvy you are and how much time you have in a summer session to become savvy with technology, but do note that the GCC library offers its services with technology. There's also the IT department at GCC, and I might be able to help as well, depending on what it is you want to do. Usually people think of PowerPoint as the first go-to. I'm not averse to PowerPoint, but I've seen PowerPoint misused in so many ways where the PowerPoint has substituted for basically the speaker, where there's too much text on the PowerPoint, or it's too confusing to read all the different kinds of fonts and colors and images on the PowerPoint. Remember, it's supposed to supplement. It's not supposed to replace. And again, you have to think about how would you be incorporating something like PowerPoint in a recorded speech. Sometimes the old ways are best. So if you wanted to show a prop or even just hold up a picture to the camera, again, you want to think about scale, you want to think about visibility. Something like having a poster that you've made up by hand. Again, be neat, be professional, that you reference during the speech. Handouts can be wonderful, but of course, this is going to be a little bit difficult because you don't have an in-person audience. Though one of the things you could do is include a link, I suppose, to your speech about a handout. But remember that the handout is, again, supposed to just emphasize important pieces of information. It's not supposed to substitute for what your speaking would be. Handouts work very well if you want somebody to walk away with specific pieces of information or exact pieces of information. So do think about the kind of technology you want to use for your visual media. And do think about how you're going to incorporate that into the speech. I can tell you that I've had experience with students using things like PowerPoint or visual media and making that a large screen and then making their face, the speech that they're giving, a small screen, a screen within a screen. It should be the exact opposite. Your face should be the big screen and the audio visual should be the small screen. Because again, this is a class in developing speaking skills. So if you decided to use supporting material, and this is going to depend on what the subject is for your informative speech, I usually suggest, especially in a condensed class, that you choose a topic that you already have some knowledge about so that you don't have to do a lot of research. That said, if you do decide that you want to do some outside research, supporting materials have been found to increase your credibility and persuasiveness, which is one of the reasons why you will be using outside resources for your third speech and your final speech. You want to make sure that the information you're using is accurate, especially if you're getting information off of the internet or artificial intelligence. There are all kinds of possibilities here for misinformation. The GCC library, which is one of the advantages you have of being a GCC student, is that you can access the library resources for free. That includes the library's electronic resources, specifically the databases, which look like the wide open internet, but they're not. These basically are sites that are electronic, but they hire staffs of individuals to serve as gatekeepers and fact checkers. So basically, they're reviewing the information before it's posted to verify some level of authenticity. I always suggest that you take everything with a grain of salt, and just because it's in a particular publication, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is error-free. But certainly there are some publications you can trust more than other publications. So I've given you the link for the GCC library, and certainly you can access the library resources. And if you have difficulty doing so, there are links there to either email a librarian or chat with the librarian or to have a phone call with the librarian, or you can do it old school and actually visit a librarian, and they can certainly help you as well. One of the things we'll talk about with the third speech is that how do you indicate when you're using an outside resource? In some ways, it's simpler than when you're writing, because when you're writing, you need to give detailed information about where that source comes from. when you're speaking, you would give less detail because you don't want to overwhelm the audience with minutia, things like publisher and place of publication and things of that nature. Usually what we do when we're speaking is we use a verbal tag. So we introduce the information that we are referencing from an outside course or an outside source by telling the audience that this is from an outside source. So even something as simple as saying, according to experts, what happens after that, the assumption is the information I'm sharing is not mine personally. It belongs to some sort of outside resource. Now, of course, I should be prepared to answer audience questions about where that resource is so that they can verify the information on their own. And when we get to our third speech, and you'll be using outside resources, I'm going to ask you to include your outside resources in your speaking outline just so that I can take a quick peek. But again, in a real life situation, you wouldn't be sharing your speaking outline with anybody. It's just there to help guide you. You can use interviews, but the idea is that you're interviewing somebody that has a certain level of expertise and you're being ethical. You're asking for their permission and making sure that they are okay with you sharing information about them. There are different kinds of evidence that you can use. Qualitative, these are anecdotes, these are stories. There's also quantitative, which are facts. One is not necessarily better than another. Both are useful, and I suggest that whenever possible, you try to use both. So, for instance, anecdotes, so the stories people have told about how strong or weak a school is. However, there are also facts to support that, things like graduation rates, for instance, or job placement rates. And when you think about the kinds of evidence that you're sharing with your audience, you're thinking about whether it is a primary account, which is firsthand, an eyewitness account, or whether it's a secondary account, which is based on primary. Again, both are useful. Ideally, you'd use both. So if you wanted to learn something about, let's say, war, then certainly you should talk to somebody who was a soldier in the war. That makes a certain level of sense. That would be a primary account. However, that soldier could be misinformed. That soldier could misremember. That soldier sees one, but not the entirety of the experience of war, which is why we also rely on secondary accounts, which are based on primary. This is where you have historians, for instance, doing research. Whether you decide to give examples, statistics, testimony, or a mix of all three, what you do want to think about is what's going to be most useful for your particular topic. Now, next class, you might have noticed that I have scheduled a reading that we've already done, but it is useful to review it about delivering speeches because that will assist you in terms of delivering your second speech. I will also give you some student sample speeches to view and to comment on, much like I did with speech number 1, so that you can get a sense of different kinds of informational speeches. And then we will have yet another quiz. And as you know, the quizzes are 20 questions, mostly short answer, some true, false, and multiple choice as well. I dropped the lowest out of the 4 quiz grades. You've already taken quiz 1, and I've already returned quiz 1 to you. So if you didn't receive it back from me, please let me know there's something wrong. Just like you should have received my feedback for speech number 1. So if you didn't, please let me know because then there's something wrong. And the quiz hopefully will review concepts that, again, will be useful to you when you are putting together your speech. So that's what next week is, but I wanted to keep today rather short because your attendance question for today, which will be due Thursday the 7th, certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. I would like you to watch all of speech number 1 postings outside of your own, though certainly you are encouraged to watch your own as well if you'd like. But I'd like you to watch all of the other speeches that were posted by your classmates. And that's in the folder entitled Speech Number 1 in the top Moodle section. And instead of posting onto our class discussion, I'd like you to send me an email, much like you did with your quizzes, and briefly indicate one strength and one weakness. It could just be a word or two for each of the speeches that you see. And then what I'm going to do is compile all of that data and share with you in the next couple classes what were some of the most commonly cited strengths and weaknesses for each of the speeches. So basically, you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and ultimately since you are sending it to my email address rather than putting it on your discussion form, you won't see your classmates' responses. But what I will do is, again, serve as gatekeeper and put together a list of commonly cited strengths and weaknesses and post that to our next class or the class following that. And certainly, if you wanted to reach out to me to talk about speech number 2 or wanted to do some kind of a practice session with me, certainly do so. I know that some of you did that with speech 1. You're certainly welcome to do that with speech 2. Not that you're required to, but certainly you're encouraged to. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will continue with the quiz and some sample informative speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.